What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Lights Camera Grow podcast. My name is Jared. I'm here again with Andrew, and today we have special guest Mykim Dang. Hi, Mykim. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, everybody. Great to be here.
Thanks for taking a few minutes out of your day to hang out with us and talk shop and all things related to the environment that we're currently in production-wise. Really excited to hear your perspective. So obviously the world looks quite different, as you know, from being in a real film production environment. How has your workload and work changed over the last 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, I would say that it's completely turned on its side. America's Test Kitchen the headquarters is based in Boston. And prior to COVID, we were 100% in studio. So, state-of-the-art production facilities. The television show was also made there. We produce photos and books and magazines and web products. So really hustling and bustling space dependent on the physical interaction connection of being with each other. Our company actually made a decision to work from home quite early. So we were able to pivot very quickly and kind of went into this fight or flight response mode where we were sort of putting out fires and figuring out the immediate priorities on how we could continue to make content, knowing that we had to give ourselves time to adjust. Things weren't going to be perfect and that we were going to learn as we went. I personally was very excited about that because, again, I come from a background of being an artist, an entrepreneur, and working with creators one-on-one. I was pushing the company to think, we've all got something in the palm of our hands that allows us to tell stories. How do we utilize that tool? So suddenly everyone understood, oh, I have a camera. Oh, I can turn my home space into something and tell my story. So it was actually really invigorating because the team now had all of these constraints in place that actually allowed them to be really creative in ways that they never thought that they were capable.
What have been some of the challenges too? Because, and like you were kind of alluding to there's a very deep connection that happens when you're in person on production and even in sometimes pre-production. How has that changed and how have you overcome some of those challenges where you can't just tap somebody on the shoulder and, say, I don't really like that. I need to, maybe reframe or let's think about that in a different way.
I would say the biggest stressors have been not just on the production crews, but also the talent because they're physically removed and they're within their own space. They now have to operate the camera. They have to deliver. They have to make sure that they're framing things correctly with the help of producers, remotely through Zoom and FaceTime and whatever tools you might be used to working with. But the idea that having one person be responsible for everything, that just, there's technical problems, internet connection, lighting, audio, everybody's working from home. So of course, the things that you don't think about on a daily basis if you're on a controlled set or in a studio are now the realities of what we all need to accommodate for. And then on the other side of it, the pre-production process becomes more intensive, right? We almost have to build in technical rehearsals and anticipate the problems that will happen and actually pre-plan to have extra shoot days before the actual shoot. So everything sort of expanded in terms of responsibility and timeline. But now that we've done a few and have a few series under our belt, we understand how to optimize that process. And everybody's a bit more forgiving, I would say.
Yeah. I would, even the public, I would say, is a lot more forgiving these days as far as the quality of the content, as long as the content is good. And that's always true, right? The context of the content has to always be good. Now that you're creating all this content in a virtual way, do you see it lending itself to living up to what is expected on TV versus what's expected online?
Yeah, so I would say that the threshold, you pointed to it a bit earlier, for the production value of certain types of content is going to be blown wide open. The fact that television broadcast, late night shows had to pivot to that format, everyone understands the power of the phone, right, in the palm of their hand. There are things that we can do to up-level that production quality, and that's where I think a lot of the producers I've collaborated with have gotten really excited. So, for example, we now have standardized kits as opposed to everyone just using their individual phone, which can cause problems when you're dealing with file transfer and media management. And now we know things like lighting and audio, the same things that we have to think about on set, they apply in this space too. So whether that's using an app like Filmic Pro, which we're big proponents of, having the same phone be sanitized and passed around and shipped, all the things that you can control, that's what you should be thinking about to make the post-production process that much smoother. You're
shipping the same kit, right? It's that iPhone, maybe like a ring light and maybe a microphone of some sort.
Exactly. And for the television show, they're using the pod model in people's homes, right?
Oh,
so
interesting.
It's a controlled environment, broadcast cameras. The talent isn't responsible for operating anything themselves. The director and the producers are dialing in remotely. So that's a bit of a different model that I think we'll continue to see across all types of content. And you can do it lo-fi too, just using Zoom or streaming live directly to YouTube. The guys over at Sandwich Video,
I was just about to bring that.
Amazing commercial for Slack.
Yep.
Yeah. So people are getting really creative.
Yeah, they sent out basically we're using a similar setup with a couple Blackmagic cameras, but they essentially sent out the Blackmagic kit with a couple lights. And I think the most amazing part to me, and this is where the time suck probably happened the most in that production, was the amount of cinematography tutorials they did ahead of time. So they did an entire cinematography series to pass along with the equipment so that their team could understand what a gaffer does and what, where do you position the light? Why is it 45 degrees from the camera? What is depth of field? Just the basic stuff that, maybe as a filmmaker you take for granted. But that's really interesting.
How quickly into this whole, since COVID happened, did you make these adjustments to sending hardware and kits out to people? Was it pretty much the first thing that you identified and just said, hey, this is like a really critical path point right here that we've got to figure out? Or did you kind of learn and from a couple of productions and then say, hey, we got to standardize this?
Yeah, I would say it was the latter. As a production team, we understood the importance and sort of saw the writing on the wall. But again, it was all about accommodating our talent and making sure they were comfortable because so much was on their shoulders. In the case of food, you also have people like stylists and art directors and people who help prepare the food. So all of those folks were no longer available to them. So after a few shoots, we optimized, we understood, and now in terms of planning for this upcoming season, we have the process much more standardized.
So is the talent then responsible for prepping the food now as well, all the way through? Wow.
They are, which has affected how we think about content selection.
Sure.
And the format, right? So to me, that's more like that seems harder to do and more challenging than the actual production part of it. So, exactly.
Okay, you touched on something earlier when you were talking about the broadcast camera setup. What do you think is going to stay around, and what do we think are we going to ever go back to somewhat of a normal production scenario?
I think it really depends on the final format, right? So you see everyone in Hollywood, for example, really pushing the pod model, filming outside the United States, controlling as much as they can, adding new staff and protocols to make sure everyone's separated and being tested constantly. If you're an independent film or a small business, you don't have the resources or time to do things that way. So for people who can shoot in small crews, whether that's in the field or a highly controlled environment, I think production folks in general, we're so collaborative and the work is so hands-on. When we were sort of assessing who's comfortable wanting to go back to the studio and who can continue to sort of run the ship from home, everybody said, I want to go back.
Right.
They this is great that we figured out this format, but it's not something that we want to do forever, or at least put at the forefront. So the way we think about content is by platform. And now what we've learned is that we can have individual talent take the reins on their own with iPhone footage, but that content probably lives on something like Facebook or Instagram, as opposed to our YouTube shows, which will continue to be a hybrid and hopefully move back in the direction of a more controlled traditional environment.
So when you're concepting for things like Facebook and Instagram, are you concepting vertically versus landscape? Is there specifics in the show that dictate that?
Yes, absolutely. I was part of a team at Facebook whose mandate was to investigate what the sort of aspect ratio constraint and small screen storytelling actually looks like now, because we consume content very differently. And that's something that I've pushed for very hard. I think traditional filmmakers and content creators, sort of the same way they argue about film versus digital.
Sure.
Right. Everyone has their preference of what they think is better. But I'm really saying, what makes sense for the audience and where they're consuming the content. So anything small that you can do around, center framing, making sure the action stays in the middle because that frame is going to change, or actually shooting different types of content based on the container. So that's something that's built into our process now. We think about social assets very differently than we do the main meat of the episode, for example.
That's really interesting. So when you're shooting those, are you sometimes shooting multi-camera at a time so you can capture it in different formats at the same time?
And another piece of process we've incorporated more recently is having a dedicated social producer. So that person might be on set just capturing, with his iPhone setup that's fully spec'd because we know that content's going straight to social.
Do you consult with the marketing teams ahead of time as you're concepting? Or is that so like an after?
We do. Video at America's Test Kitchen touches every business unit. So we have a bit of a different briefing process and different producers working on and with different teams. So for something like marketing, which has different needs than an original series on YouTube, we might partner more closely with social, anything that's going on their channels versus an email campaign or on a landing page or part of a promotion. But it is something that we consider to be integral to our briefing process. That to me is, again, that left brain, right brain, like the full stack view. How can you make stuff without understanding where it's going to go?
Sure.
Like the container shapes the content.
You'd be surprised. Well, I'm sure you had experience, but you'd be surprised. Yeah, you totally get.
No, I think that's such an important. And you keep going back to this concept of like this full stack bunch of capabilities, and I think that point you made earlier about how being a generalist these days is actually important just because of the fact that technology, processes, methodologies, they change so fast. And it's like back in the day, you're an expert at Cobalt,
Yeah.
and like you can't do that anymore, right? Because quickly, if you become that expert, it's quickly becoming outdated. Yep. And so even in like, kind of like you mentioned, in an environment like today, where you have to be kind of creative with how you're going to get things done, understanding things from multiple perspectives is a much more efficient way, right? To being able to rework your pipeline, rework your process, something that you've really been used to. So I think COVID and everything that's happened here has really, like to your point, made people more creative, but at the same time, I think you got to flex more muscles in your mind in a way, right? To really figure out like how to adapt to all of this.
So jumping around, what does your creative process look like when you're starting from the beginning?
I think I know what you're asking me, but I would say that generally there's a period of development where you're open-ended, right? To your point, me personally, I draw a lot of sources of research and inspiration, and typically outside the boundaries of whatever the project is. So in the context of America's Test Kitchen and food, I'm actually going to look at other sources of media and inspiration that are outside the food world. So that's something personally that I feel very strongly about, again, just from my background and the way that I've sort of made stuff across different mediums. And that's to me where the magic sort of happens, right? Like you make these connections or you find these influences that might work or might not work, and then prototyping. And that's sort of where the tech and the marketing background comes back in, because I might be really invested, or as a creative person, be very tied to the vision I have for this project or this story. But the truth is, it's going to go out there into the world, right? So why not take one story, chop it up and tell it a bunch of different ways, get some feedback on it, have other people go through the same process, and let's bring it all back together and figure out what parts of it might actually make it into the final story. And then you have this whole reserve that might end up taking form in other ideas and other content, and can also act as ancillary content or short form, cutting room floor type content that can be repackaged for social and other channels. So for me, that upfront work and that process and sort of the white space is really important before I dive into defining the parameters of what this thing is.
Yeah, I feel like I could live in that phase forever, but then I'm pretty sure Andrew would just kill me. Because we'd never get anything off the ground. I would just be like, no, it's not there yet. It's not there yet. We got to keep going. Noodle. So yeah, the prototyping phase I can totally relate to. But you're right. At some point, it's got to get off the ground and it's got to go out to the world. Otherwise, what are we doing?
I'm a big fan of time boxing. I think creative people sometimes feel pressured by that, but I love the idea that set a parameter for yourself. Focus on one or two ideas and just go with it and see what happens at the end of that 30-minute or hour-long block.
Yeah. I need to try that more. I've definitely done that. But yeah, I feel like I work under deadline pressure way better anyway. And I think a lot of creatives would probably say similar. Outside of America's Test Kitchen, what other big productions have you worked on?
Honestly, I'm really proud of the work I was able to do at the Video Lab at Facebook and Instagram. A lot of that thinking around, like I said, small screen storytelling. Recently, Apple, of course, they do everything beautifully. They just partnered with Damien Chazelle and did, vertical cinema, for example. And these are concepts that I was pushing creative people and filmmakers alike to really understand, what happens when it looks like this as opposed to this? What are the creative challenges as opposed to looking down on it as a medium and saying there's only one way to tell the story? So I'm really, really proud of the work and the thinking that was developed during my time there. And then it translated into Curated by Facebook, which was highlighting highlighting creators across the platform. So people and artists who are using Facebook and Instagram in really interesting ways. So platform specificity, having people who develop AR filters and telling entire films specifically through those lenses, everything from the pen tool to stickers to actual, lenses that they're making themselves. The possibilities were just infinite. So it was really cool to be able to support that ecosystem. And then full circle, I would say like the live production. So that's what I did a lifetime ago. And then that's all come full circle. And now everyone needs to know how to stream live or broadcast over Zoom. So it's been fun to help people figure that out for themselves too.
And we've tried to experiment with every type of small screen style format for our own, purposes, and just to see what was, working and what the trends were and if anything was going to catch on. And it's been really an interesting journey because I feel like IG or Instagram bought into it really hard. They were like, okay, this is going to be our vertical format. But then quickly they were like, oh, well, we're just going to give you the landscape option. Now you just flip the screen and now you can upload landscape as well.
Have you gotten involved in any projects like that with like Quibi or any of those types of like small screen format type projects?
Nothing with Quibi, but I agree Turnstile was really slick. And I personally thought that was the strongest part of the experience. But I didn't fall in love with any of the content or the storytelling either. And the thing I'd say about, vertical, it's not vertical versus horizontal. The idea that you could actually have a different story if you held your screen vertically as opposed to horizontally, as opposed to just an optimized adaptation, that to me was the missed opportunity. Because you look at things like screen reality, right? Take live action out of the picture. You could have an entire film told through the perspective of text messages and video chats, right? Like, where was the creativity around exploring like truly what is the possibility when you restrict it to the phone? And then with Instagram TV, they listen to the community and creators, right? People, I would say they were ahead of their time in that people weren't thinking about shooting content this way. So in order for them to get adoption on the platform, they enabled landscape because now people could just upload the content they were already making for other platforms.
The product team won.
Yeah, they did. And like, it's so interesting to see what's happening with Reels now, right?
Yeah.
The content on Reels.
Right.
Yeah.
It's TikTok. It's got TikTok.
How coincidental it comes out at this exact moment. Yeah. Reels is it's going to be an interesting case study over the next several months on how whatever they can capture. And one thing, I was listening to an interview with the head of product for Reels, and he was saying that the one thing Instagram has as a platform over TikTok and Snapchat is they have the business marketplace aspect, so you can be a business with inside of Instagram, which I thought was really interesting, and it'll be interesting to see if any of the other platforms really adopt that.
I'm curious, like as a creative, but also someone that straddles both like the business side and the creative side, when you see a platform like Instagram, like releasing Reels, and they have this e-commerce component to it, and there's obviously a monetization function behind the content that's pretty direct. Like, what's your take on that? Is that kind of dilute like the creativity that comes out of it? Or is it just, how do you look at like trying to mix e-commerce with content? And now there's this very interesting intersection where you can literally monetize the content by purchasing something directly from it, right? What's your take on that? Like, is that a good evolution for where we're headed in content creation, or is it something that we should be a little weary of?
I would say that I think that it is something that you can't avoid when thinking about making stuff for these platforms. Fair. So the one thing I really push my creative collaborators to remember is that I say this all the time, and you know this yourself, I'm sure. When you're making a living off your creativity, the separation is really important. So the way that I like to run projects and teams is having the white space, like I said, where we're making things that aren't tied to business objectives, but everything else at the end of the day is for a project, it's for a client, it's for a business. So we have to understand the opportunities there around monetization. Can we do it in a way that's natural, where we're not actually selling? Of course. but the opportunity is there, and we'll continue to get resources invested in that platform if we can show that return.
Yeah, right.
That's the marketing speak, right? Exactly what you're talking about.
100%. Yeah, and for us, because we work with a lot of brands, and our approach to marketing is provide value and be helpful through content first before you ask for the sale. And the people that engage with this content that you're trying to be helpful with or resourceful to, right? Those are the folks that are going to fall through your funnel, right? They're going to proceed further down the funnel. And I think the challenge sometimes is in working with the clients is, you don't go straight for the sale in putting up that YouTube video. That's the worst thing you can probably do, right? You want to build trust. You want to show personality. You want to get them to see that other aspect of your company or your brand or whatever you're trying to convey to them. And so I think it's for us, it's always trying to find that right balance too between like, how are you creating something that is helpful to your audience or educational or entertaining to your audience to build trust with them first. And then the whole monetization thing becomes a little less icky. You know what I mean? When you connect with someone where you're really truly engaging on some level of trust or being helpful or something along those lines. So it's interesting I'm always curious to ask that question of folks who have a creative background as well, but also folks who have a creative and business background. And I usually get that similar answer, which is like, hey, we can create more cool stuff if we can show some sort of return on some of this other stuff that we're doing too,
One last question. This is a question that we ask all the guests. Number one, do you listen to podcasts?
I do.
Okay. Number two, what are your favorite podcasts right now?
Right now, the Center for Humane Tech has an excellent podcast that I recommend to everyone. That's my number one. Today Explained is sort of my go-to to keep in touch with everything. Reply All will be the last.
Oh, nice. Yeah, Reply All.
Awesome.
Yeah. You can see the themes of my podcast listeners.
Very cool. Where can everybody find all things Mykim?
I'm on all the social platforms, just at Mykim Dang, and my website is my name. So you can get in touch anytime. And I love talking about this with fellow content creators and marketers. So always happy to be a resource.
Awesome. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Absolutely, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Lights, Camera, Grow. Thanks to Mykim for being on. And thanks to our team who helped put this together. If you like what you heard, make sure you rate, subscribe, and tell a friend about the Lights, Camera, Grow podcast. And for more information about Tobe Agency, head on over to tobeagency.co. Thanks for listening.